Alright, what is up, guys? I hope you guys are doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. Basically going to start going over the Federal Reserve System from the point of view of Paul Warburg, kind of one of the founding fathers of the system in general, but mostly just kind of starting off the whole kind of, I guess you could call it case study. It'll basically be a series of videos, not sure how long, that will be about kind of his perspective, some of his stories, and essentially going over that 800-something page book that he wrote about the origins of the Federal Reserve itself and kind of how he played into it. And it's really written in kind of a narrative fashion, which is kind of, I think it's interesting. It makes it very easy to understand it, not just chronologically, because there's some times where he bounces around in time, but to see kind of not only just the kind of academic dynamic that there was, right, but also the political dynamic as well that was affecting the Federal Reserve Act as it was progressing through, say, Congress, right, and also just kind of society in general, because this is also, you have to keep in mind, back in the early 1900s, kind of the general American sentiment for central banking in general was not positive, to say the least. Like, they've already had 2 failures, if you want to count before the American Revolution, and the whole, like, signing of the Constitution and everything. It'd technically be 3, because I believe technically Massachusetts had a central bank before the American Revolution, but I don't remember the exact date on that one, just that it was before. But other than that, we had the first and second Bank of the United States, and the Federal Reserve is quote-unquote the third or fourth, depending on if you want to count that Massachusetts one. With that being said, kind of looking more on, or giving more of an idea of how a bill passes in general, right? And not like the technicalities of how it moves through Congress and things like that, or that it gets passed by the Senate, or you know what I mean, right? Not that kind of stuff, but more of just like, how does it start in general? Like, how do they even come up with these concepts? And Warburg's kind of, I guess, argument in a way is that by the time legislators actually get the piece or make any piece of legislation, it's more than half made already, right, before they even start to think about doing it, right? And part of this is because I'm sorry, let me articulate that a little bit better. So it's not so much that legislators don't really create the laws in their whole, it's more of they kind of put the finishing touches on it, is how he words it specifically, right? And to kind of give more of a explicit explicit articulation of this concept, I'm going to actually quote him. So the mode of power in lawmaking is all supplied by somewhere outside the legislative halls, kind of the populace in general, right? Some intellect outside the realm of active politics first conceives an idea, it spreads to the minds of other individuals, slowly at first, but gradually gaining momentum. And then, skipping a few sentences, a law is half made and more than half made when a large body of aggressive support has been mobilized among the voters. Yet during this part of the process, the legislative bodies have nothing whatever to do with it, right? And so basically, the society in general of whatever country you're talking about, before they pass some legislation, has already more or less made the law in terms of general concept, the direction it's going, things like that. And then basically this legislative body, whatever the example may be, takes it from there and put the finishing touches on it, as he puts it, right? So in order, however, that a proposed bill may be placed upon the statute book, it is its inevitable fate to become subject of political and often partisan action. A parliamentary government cannot function effectually without a party system, right? And so basically we all know that there's a bunch of pork in a lot of the congressional bills and everything else, right? There's always other things that don't specifically have to do with the bill itself, and I think it's pretty obvious with that you have bills that are literally thousands of pages long, right? Granted, you need to be very nuanced with legislation, but it's also like I think it's pretty well known that a lot of the provisions in there don't typically have anything to do with, like, especially like the title of the bill at all. So that being said, I don't know, I think it's rather self-explanatory, I guess. So yeah. So it's really like the bill is made before it even hits the hall of the legislative body, right? And then they just essentially put the finishing touches on it and kick it out the door, so to speak. But there's beyond that, a lot of the times those finishing touches kind of come along in those partisan kind of pushing it back and forth. It's kind of like a tug of war in a way. And I think he uses the term specifically like minor concessions in either direction depending on who's in power. So like which way it kind of leans. And so we really saw this with the Federal Reserve Act, and now I'm kind of completely going off the book. Out of the book. I'm not even looking at it for this part because I don't think I have any more notes. But anyway, with the Federal Reserve Act, we really saw this with, for example, kind of the how the Board of Governors was going to be appointed or elected or whatever way. Because there were multiple ways throughout the different bills that they had. Like they had the Aldrich plan, which was mostly made by Republicans. In a way, it's the main Senator Nelson Aldrich was a prominent Republican at the time. He was kind of like the head of the party. And with that being said, yes, he was running the bill, but there was a lot of bipartisan action within the actual curation of the plan in general, right? And so it was really kind of focused to have it as nonpartisan in general, at least from Paul Warburg's point of view, how he describes it, right? And so it wasn't until you could see where the partisan part in terms of leaning towards the Republican side was with the power structure of the Federal Reserve, and that was kind of the big argument between the two parties on how it would come about, right? And so like how would they be elected and who would be in there. So there was a lot from the Aldrich plan. It was a lot more leaning towards a decentralized approach in a way, to where especially the Board of Governors was not fully elected by the president. Appointed technically by the president. There was a lot more business interests involved, right? And it was supposed to be a lot not as tied to the government, so to speak. Whereas for the Glass-Owen bill, the Democratic side of it, the one that actually became the Federal Reserve Act, was quite the opposite. They had it to where every single Board of Governors or governor on the board would be appointed by the president, right? So it was very much the president had kind of sweeping power over that entity in general in terms of appointing them, to whereas the other ones had other people elected from, say, like different districts for banking and stuff like that. So yes. And you really kind of saw this with the argument for, I'm trying to think of the best way to actually put this. And so whenever there's a big hole in kind of the history in terms of the origins of itself of the Federal Reserve, like he talks explicitly about some of the books and things that are written about, say, like the operations of the Federal Reserve, and that there's a lot of them, right? And a lot of good ones. But in terms of like the actual genesis of it, not so much. To where it's pretty much just this book to where he gives his point of view, and then there's the Glass-Owens side of things to where Senator Owen, I believe he was the one who wrote the book, one of the Glass-Owen people. And from his side of things, to where he basically tried to discredit all of Aldrich's plans, right? He basically took a lot from the Aldrich plan, but didn't want to give any credit to it. And he kind of, in his version of the book, he kind of explicitly states that, and he calls, he can be rather derogatory in an academic sense towards that side of things, and I think especially Warburg in some aspects, right? And Warburg kind of goes throughout how that dynamic changed as he helped them, because Warburg also kind of advised them as well whenever they were making the bill. So, and you can really see that with how they try to discredit the Aldrich plan. And even though because there's a big section in Warburg's book to where he has kind of a juxtaposition of the texts. And so he has the Aldrich plan with the National Reserve Association, and then he has the Federal Reserve Act with the Federal Reserve side by side, and literally going provision by provision, like about the same thing, obviously. So if one's about like open market operations for the Aldrich plan, he'll have open market operations for the Federal Reserve right next to it. And it's the actual verbatim print of the legislation for the first draft, because the Federal Reserve Act has been amended a few times. So keeping that in mind. And that was pretty interesting, so to speak. But yeah, main takeaways, you'd be surprised on how little Congress, for the example of the United States, would have in the actual kind of construction of the conceptual part of the bill, right? That's kind of, at least from Warburg's point of view and from his experience with the Federal Reserve Act, right? It was mostly just this kind of group of, his co-workers or whatever you want to call them, the people that were working with him on it. He was a part of so many committees, and he actually goes in there one by one and talks about like all the trade associations he would work with and things like that, which we'll get more in depth when we get there. But it's also like, yeah. But anyways, I'm going to leave that there. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.